Hello, guys, and welcome to Fiat Lux. Today on the show, we have Josh and Jelani from DeSci World. Welcome, guys.
Hey, thanks for having us.
Yes, thank you, Russ, very much for having us here.
Not a problem. So, let's jump straight into it. What is DeSci and what is DeSci World?
Okay.
Let me tackle the DeSci, and Josh, you can tackle the DeSci world. So, DeSci is a Web3 initiative similar to DeFi as a means to kind of revolutionize and change the current infrastructure of STEM. So that's science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Um, so there exists a lot of similar to the traditional financial system. There are a lot of misaligned incentives and archaic systems that exist in the scientific industry. And so the mission of DeSci is to come together and try to bring science back to its status as a public good, realign these incentives, make sure that people who are doing the scientific work are rewarded for the efforts that they put in, and kind of bringing science back to the public. And as it relates to DeSci World, I will defer this to Joshua, who was the actual founder of DeSci World.
Thanks, Jelani. So DeSci World is essentially just trying to become the global hub of DeSci, the stuff that Jelani just mentioned, right? We are a gateway for the average person to come from the outside into DeSci and understand everything that's going on, to get access to information, to get access to projects, to get access to networks and resources that are building and useful for you within the DeSci space. So there's retail flow, so people who don't know anything about DeSci but are scientists or academia in the traditional sense, they might be empowered by the tooling that we're building in DeSci or empowered by the other projects that are already building. They can come to us and find out some more information. Or if you're a D-scientist yourself and you're trying to operate in DeSci, you can also come to us and you can find access to, as I said, resources, networks, and other opportunities to help boost you in your journey into DeSci.
Okay, that's a good explanation. So one of the things that I hear that's kind of different about DeSci, or one of the maybe you say like main aims of the community, is to change the funding mechanisms in the scientific world. Maybe could you talk a little bit about how that's different, how these funding mechanisms affect the work that people do in science? And maybe talk about some of your own efforts towards, funding projects and how maybe any novel mechanisms that you found.
Jelani, do you want to
Um,
tackle the funding and how it's different?
yeah, so I'm a scientist by training, a neuroimmunologist, and so I've spent a lot of time in both the academic and I also worked in biotech space for a little bit. And so traditionally, when you have your own lab in science and you're doing basic research at a university, you get funding from the government. So most scientific funding is actually curried through tax dollars and public funding. Um, but the issue here is that there are very small pools. So it's a lot of money, but the individuals who tend to get this money are often part of a brotherhood of individuals, right? It's very hard to break into this funding sphere. So what you'll find is that a lot of new scientists, nascent scientists, spend a lot of time. Once you graduate from being a trained researcher, most of your time is spent writing grants to get this money, and it doesn't get distributed very well. And as with the advent of more and more individuals coming into science, this accessibility to these pools becomes smaller and smaller. The competition becomes higher and higher, and it's much more difficult. And for those listeners who have had a chance to listen to Balaji and talking about his network state, what is been found is that if you track uh, funding and those who get funded over the span of last 30 or 40 years, what you notice is that the median age of people who get funding shifts with that over time. So what that indicates is that the same group of individuals who were there at the beginning of this funding scheme, this implementation of this funding scheme, are the ones who prioritarily get this funding. And so that's kind of there exists, people have different terminologies for this, but there exists a limited pool of individuals who get this. It's almost like a brotherhood of play. Now, that's one aspect of it. If you take it further into things like drug development out of basic research, but actually applied, research and applied science, whether it be, and I come from the biomedical space, so I'm going to speak mostly about the biomedical space. When it comes to drug discovery and drug therapies, there's this scenario where most science is very difficult to achieve, right? Science is rife with failure. And so investors are very risk averse when it comes to funding scientific projects, right? It takes billions of dollars to bring a basic scientific therapy to market. That's a lot of money. And when that's rife with failure, of course, investment companies, pharmaceuticals, VCs are going to be very choosy with how they do it. But the problem with that is that there becomes what that creates is this phenomenon known as the valley of death, where there's a lot of science, basic science, that has fundamental substance to it. So it has a lot of potential. But because investment companies are risk averse, or the therapies don't align with their particular incentives or their agendas or the political agendas, this research does not get funded. And so there's a lot of really potential useful things that can increase the quality of life of humans that are kind of just left to the wayside. And so what DeSci is doing is similar to DeFi, and I'm going to relate it back to DeFi often, is we're trying to develop these alternative funding structures that take it out of the sole hands of VCs and government and bring it back to the people. So a good example of this is, let's say you're a patient group. Let's say you have a rare disease. You're a group of individuals who have rare disease, and there's somebody who is trying to develop a therapy for your particular disease. Now, pharma doesn't tend to really focus too much on this because the population, the cohort of individuals that they can sell therapies to, is very small. And it's a much higher risk to develop a therapy for a very niche group of individuals. But that cuts out these individuals from being able to increase their quality of life. So in DeSci, what people are trying to build, and what people are successfully building, is a means of which for these patient populations to come together and raise funds to fund the research that may be directly impactful to them. So it's opening up the scientific funding infrastructure to not just high capital, net worth, accredited investors, but people who are directly impacted by this. So that's one example of the funding structures that are being built in the DeSci space. There are a lot of primitives that are being um, put together to use this. So DAOs are one example of this. So DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations where people can come together and pool their capital, but not also their experience and their mind share to kind of solve problems. And so they're taking that same approach to address some of these funding issues in DeSci. And one of the main, not it's not a Web3 primitive per se, but one of the main utilities that are being developed out of this are things known as IP NFTs. And so these are a framework that allows for a DAO to help fund a scientific project, a potential therapy or innovation, and also obtain ownership in it. So if you're a patient group, as an example, if you're a patient group and you help fund a therapy that is directly impactful to you, well, you also attain certain ownership over that therapeutic. And how that breaks down is dependent on how the DAO infrastructure has. But this is new. Before, the regular day-to-day Joe did not have an input in what was developed and what was funded.
Yeah, I mean, so I just want to sort of build on that because Jelani alluded to it by saying the DeSci funding connection is there. So the reason, one of the reasons why I think you brought up funding first is because it's definitely the most established and most visible side to DeSci. And I always say that because the funding side is basically DeFi, which is already pretty well established and pretty much built. There's all kinds of different mechanisms that we can use using DeFi to raise funds. Even is it lending? Is it borrowing? Is it crowdsourcing, DAO crowdsourcing? Is it selling NFTs? Is it selling tokens? All this sort of stuff. So that has kind of been built for the past 2.5, 3 years, and is sort of pretty successful right now, which is why the funding aspect of DeSci is so powerful. Obviously, funding, aside from the fact that it's already built, is incredibly important to science and to DeSci and to scientists. But it is just one of those things where it's really interesting because it's already built, it is being applied right now to the DeSci space, when actually the DeSci space is 5 or 6 or 7 different levels of, or different categories of things to change, and funding is just one of them. The funding landscape that is being built in DeSci right now, like for example with the IP NFT, this allows you to have more ownership, as Lonnie said, over the content that you're creating, over the research that you're doing, which is a bit, a big thing. There are a number of other sort of mechanisms being built. I won't go into this one because I don't know it fully so well. It's brand new. But the HyperCert framework, which is being developed by Protocol Labs, is something that's really hot right now on the lips of most DeSci people. So HyperCert frameworks, but I won't try and explain it, I'm afraid. But it's also not just the way of gaining money, but it's also the way of distributing the money and handling the money, which, as Jelani alluded to again with the DAOs, this is what's super important in the DeSci space. It's not just funding for projects and funding for research, but it's also changing the incentive mechanism. Once you get the funding for your grant and then you perform the research, you get your results, or you decide to go further and you go to applied science, and you go to actual producing products. How do you share that money? How do you share that funding? You're sharing it with patient groups. This is a huge thing, right? You own your data. Say, for example, you have healthcare data, and rather than the healthcare provider taking your data and using it how they will, you can have ownership over your healthcare data. And companies that want to access your genomic records or want to access some information about your diabetes, they have to pay you directly. So this is all kind of tying in with the funding side of DeSci, and it's really important. It's not just for how do I get money for my research, it's how do I completely flip the script on the incentive mechanisms within science, research, healthcare, all this, using funding or using the blockchain infrastructure, which underlying is kind of DeFi.
Okay, so just for the layman, people might be listening, might not understand what a DAO is, and obviously it's a common structure within the crypto DeFi community. If you wouldn't mind, could you just explain what a DAO is, just to anyone that might be a bit confused about that term?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so I'll give the first view, which is a decentralized autonomous organization. So it implies it's an organization which is distributed around the world using blockchain infrastructure. And it implies that it's autonomous in the sense that it kind of runs itself according to smart contract infrastructure. The smart contract will execute and then it will perform said requirement. This is a caveat because right now, DAO tooling is not such that it is autonomous. We'll just make that clear. But we're going to assume in this case that it is, and that DAO tooling is working so well that whenever a decision is made by the organization, by the DAO, that it automatically executes such that there is no single point of failure. Right now, if you have a business and the manager decides to do something, then he has to be the one to do that. They have to be the one to do that. In a true DAO, the idea is that these decisions, these governance decisions, will automatically execute so that there is no trust point at the end of it. But put more simply, right, a DAO is just a distributed group of people that combine resources and networks and ideas to operate under a common goal. Okay. Traditionally, typically, we're saying they're using blockchain infrastructure. So they're using a Gnosis safe, which is a multi-signature wallet where you have you have your money in, and a certain amount of people must confirm transactions before it can be released. This is a security layer, and you can use online communication platforms such as any, social media, Discord, whatever. That is what a DAO is right now. It is very early, but DAOs are probably going to be the future of organization for most people who don't work for a corporation, because it's incredibly lightweight. It's basically free to set up. It has very little restrictions. You can kind of operate however you wish, but you can use the blockchain infrastructure. You can use tokenization to allow you to have governance over this protocol, to have security over the shared funding, and these sorts of things. Like, it just makes working as a non-official entity much safer and much more efficient.
Yeah, I think one of the key things that maybe people need to understand about DAOs is that it's, a different way of doing an organization. So not only the things that you mentioned, but there's also, I guess you could say, a different take on the, hierarchy inside an organization. It's more maybe collaborative or cooperative. Looking at some of the things that are in the traditional world, maybe you could say, maybe more closer to like a traditional co-op.
Yeah.
And I think that's, as you said, it's sort of, you don't have to, so it's an unofficial way, or it's a way of getting into it without going through the traditional gatekeepers, essentially. And obviously that process is still being worked on. The systems are democratic, and we're looking at different ways to vote on things, which I think is really important. I've seen some extremely novel voting mechanisms in the crypto space, which is really interesting when you contrast it to the traditional world of governance and democracy, right? It's been the same for 50 years, right? Like, but in crypto you see many different ways of organizing, and that's always been really interesting to me. And I think it's going to be really interesting in the I guess the present now and in the future going forward to see how those things interact with the scientific community. So on that note, we're talking about collaboration and incentives and funding and things. I'd like to talk maybe a bit about narratives in science, and how important narratives are. So, is there a narrative in the DeSci world that you guys think is important to get out there? What is kind of like the promise, the vision? If that makes sense. What is the narrative of DeSci?
I want to jump in, Jelani, but I'm going to give it back to you in just a sec. Right? I think this is really subjective because right now there is no narrative control. And for me, that's what DeSci and DeFi and crypto is all about, is just taking narrative control out of the picture. There is a narrative control in many aspects of the world right now. Science and academia has a narrative control. So if you were to say, what is the narrative of DeSci? If I sit here and say my narrative, which I have and will tell you, then and assume that is the DeSci narrative, then that's a form of narrative control. So I think that I will tell you mine in a sec. I'll let Jelani go next, but I do think that the biggest thing that underlines all of it is that there is no narrative control. There are just multiple narratives that some people buy into and some people don't.
Do you want to give your narrative?
Okay, I'll give my narrative. My narrative is removing narrative control from these institutions. And I'm all power to the people, right? I'm distribution of resources, distribution of opportunity, not necessarily distribution of wealth. I think that is quite misguided in many ways, but people should have access to the opportunities that everybody else does. Equality of opportunities is basically my narrative. When it comes to science, that extends really you can see how that extends really far in terms of people with any mindset or any opinions on anything being able to do the science that they believe with equal opportunity. You can see how that opens the floodgates to new possibilities, right? But Jelani, who is established, I want to hear your narrative of what DeSci is.
Right. So I I agree with Joshua. So the my personal narrative of DeSci is that it provides accessibility. So it's open access, open science in its truest form, or the mission is to make open science be its most optimal form with this new tech stack. So making sure that anybody who has any form of science curiosity or science literacy or just wants to delve into learning more about scientific fields, whether it be biomedical or physical or astrophysics or what have you, psychology, has the opportunity to do so with minimal barriers. And this, is not this pertains to globally, right? So there are a lot of barriers that exist in the world: financial barriers, access point barriers, credential barriers. And what I think one thing that we like to touch upon, and that we didn't touch upon in the DAO description, is that DAOs, I think in their best form, are meritocracies. So if you have a certain skill set, even if they say you're not a PhD like me, but you have some skill set that you brought onto yourself, you've done in research, you know how to run a PCR, which is polymerase chain reaction. You have some skill that you've developed. Well, you can come to a DAO and you can put forth your capacity to do these things. And oftentimes, I've never seen it be refused. DAOs will accept you in and they'll slot you in where you can be useful, and you can get value out of that yourself. So it kind of breaks down this barrier of needing to be going to these high credential or these high affluent universities and institutions to be able to contribute to the scientific hive mind. Um, and so examples of that in the funding and other access is just giving access to science back to the individual and taking it out of the ivory tower. I think one beautiful way that Josh sometimes puts it is we're trying to not necessarily destroy the ivory tower, but bring that power structure down a notch such that other people and everybody else can have access to it. So again, the philosophy that I have for DeSci is accessibility and equity in the scientific realm. Are there narratives in the DeSci space? As Josh put it, there are. They're subjective. You'll find it in different spaces. DeSci right now is very heavily dominated by the biomedical sphere of science, so drug development and bio clinical trials, bio-relevant practices. But that's not all of what science is, right? There's physics, there's chemistry, there's psychology, there's all forms of science. And what we're hoping for is that these accessibility are going to bring more of these individuals into the space. And that will ultimately change the narrative over time. But I think overall, the narrative is accessibility. Now, whether that's being truly pushed forth by everybody, to the same degree, that's here or there, right? There's always going to be agendas. There's always going to be personal um, perspectives in the space, but that kind of comes par for the course with humanity, right? If you're going to open it up to everybody, you're going to get people's input, and it's going to bias. But how I view it, and I say it all the time, DeSci Web3 is a mosaic, and the more people we get in, the more that mosaic becomes. It becomes even more mosaic. So you won't have these power concentrations as we have more people coming into the space.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, just to circle back to the, I suppose the accessibility and the conversation about DAOs and hierarchies and the gatekeepers and things, and obviously the question I started with about narratives. I think one of the interesting things about crypto and DeFi and this whole space in general, is that obviously there are scammers and things, and obviously there are bad actors, bad faith, all that sort of stuff, right? The people that are in the DeFi world are still human. But one of the things that I think is really important for people to understand from the outside that maybe don't understand the kind of foundations of the space is the permissionlessness and the fact that anyone can join, right? Regardless of gender, race, religion, state affiliation, etc., etc. And that's built in to the very core of the technology, and it's very hard to. I mean, it's almost impossible to get around that. And so one of the things, just to circle it back and connect it to the narrative question, is that it does actually make it, in my take on things, it makes it harder to develop, these narratives that are, twisted or have an ideological bent, because the thing about blockchains is it's public and it's transparent, and 1 + 1 always equals 2, right? And if you can see the code, I mean, that's the big difference to me, in this space, is that it's easy to say one thing, right, and fool people with, media campaigns and all this kind of stuff, but the code will always be there. This bit of money got transferred to this wallet, right? Someone says, "Oh, I'm not stealing money. We're not funding this guy." Well, we can see it. It's right there. So it's actually a lot harder, I would say, to develop narratives and have these narratives persist. I mean, you can still get away with it for a little while, but eventually someone's going to look at the blockchain and they're going to see that, okay, X, Y, and Z did not happen. Smart contract did not execute, and so that's one of the things that I really like. And I think that is going to go quite a way to kind of removing some of these, disingenuous narratives and the control over narratives in general for not only, science, but also finance and art and et cetera, et cetera.
So I want to actually, I'm quite black-pilled about this, right? I actually want to disagree with that, right? When the narrative is controlled by financial flows because they're obfuscated and they can do what they want, then that's one thing, right? But when financial flows are transparent and therefore can't be controlled illicitly by these financial flows, the narrative has to be controlled some other way, and that's probably through society and culture and other social means, which means that, well, if people know what you're spending and you want to do something fairly dastardly, you have to make it so that people are okay with you doing that dastardly thing and spending that dastardly money, right? So for me, that actually leads us down a road of we really have to make much more care, not just of our banks and our transactional flows, but we have to take real care of our minds and how influenced we are by society and culture pushing forward. If everybody is operating on DeFi and the blockchain and can't use money to mess around and influence people, then they'll just use culture to do so, which is already happening and has been happening for millennia, arguably, right? But especially now, so the culture war is incredible. So that kind of narrative control is going to happen regardless of whether or not it's because they're funding certain parties or because they're saying certain things and putting certain ideas out there. The beauty of DeSci and the beauty of blockchain in general is that it allows you to have the information to make your own choices, and no one can take those choices down. No one can stop you from getting that information if it's done properly, right?
So you mentioned. Go ahead, Jelani.
Yeah, I just want to add one little thing on top of what Josh has said. So, in addition to the issue of narrative being driven by obfuscation of financial capital flows, so that's one almost proactive means of malicious intent or of controlling of a scenario. But there's also a passive one that exists under that, right? So narrative, no matter what, is going to be controlled by those who can do. And capital flow determines what you can and cannot do. So even if you have the greatest of intentions in the world of funding particular interests, that doesn't mean that you're going to be that you're not going to have a narrative that comes with that, right? And we see this as an example of most scientific research and funding is very much headquartered and centralized in the Northern Hemisphere. And science is the process of solving problems, oftentimes related to those people who are suffering of those problems. And so what you'll notice is that there's a difference in the priority of science if you go to different regional groups. And we'll touch upon this a little bit later, but if you come into the DeSci space, and this is an active initiative from DeSci World, where there are these DeSci regional groups, DeSci Latin America, Brazil, DeSci China, Japan, Africa. And the reason that, well, these have come together organically, but the reason that we're pulling these together is that we recognize that priorities, scientific priorities, problem-solving priorities are not the same in Africa and sub-Saharan Africa as they are in Brazil or in Europe. But most of the money is concentrated in Europe and North America. And so that means that the science that is getting funded may not necessarily address what is happening down here. And so part of the goal of the DeSci space is to actually have that redistribution of funds, make it such that individuals who are located not necessarily here, who may be here and recognize that there's this disparity of money flow, can start to eke this money down to address people who have been traditionally underrepresented or underserved in the scientific space. And again, that's not a proactive malicious event. It's just that's where the money is concentrated, and so that's where these narratives arise. And so again, to Josh's point, yes, we want to obliterate this concept of narrative by allowing this cash flow or this money flow or capital flow and brain power to redistribute itself fully. So I think there's two layers of narrative flow, but either way, the point is to get around all of these and make it such the space much more equitable.
Yeah, and I think just to Josh's point, I think there is something to be said about the fact that it's transparent and open to anyone, and obviously, people sometimes like to do things anonymously, right? And so the transparent nature of it can sometimes have the opposite effect. Like maybe you don't want to send money to that wallet to fund that scientific experiment because it's frowned upon by the circles that you hang around in. And then on the flip side of that, there's also a discussion about privacy and confidential transactions and things like that. Maybe you want to fund something anonymously, so we need to look at funding mechanisms and blockchains and things like that provide an anonymity. I was listening to a discussion between someone from the Solarpunk community and the Lunarpunk community recently on the Green Pill podcast. And I thought the person representing the Lunarpunk side of the argument made a really good point about the fact that to have at the base layer, privacy is paramount, at least from this person's worldview. And the way they explained it was really simple, and it makes a lot of sense, right? Like if you live in an authoritarian state, and if you're surveilled and everything that you do is public and open, then are you really allowed to have a political opinion? Because you're always going to be swayed or influenced by what you think either people can see of you, or by, you know, what the prevailing, you know, control mechanism is, how they view your views, essentially. So, you know, without privacy, can you really have an opinion? Can you really pursue the things that you want to pursue? And that kind of made a lot of sense to me. You know, if you think about this kind of like, you know, Orwellian future where, you know, that we're don't want to say we're moving into, but, you know, we are being surveilled a lot more and more as time goes on. And whether that's nefarious or not, that's not what I'm trying to say. I'm just saying it's just a fact, right? There's cameras everywhere. We have microphones everywhere. And so, you know, in that situation, you do have to question, well, if I don't feel like I can have a thought and opinion, do I really have one? Like, is anyone's you know, opinions on things, their political beliefs, are they really genuine, or are they always hiding away and suppressing what they really think because they're aware constantly? I think is there some like experiment, was it the panopticon or something? There's some kind of like philosophical experiment or something, or like what do you call them now? Thought experiment. Sorry, yeah, that's this. Yeah, thought experiment. That kind of feels a bit similar to what I'm talking about.
I think generally we're in a big thought experiment now regarding crypto, right? Like, we are trying to figure out how what we're building right now in DeFi and crypto in general is going to affect us in a political sense moving forward. Like, there's a couple of things. There's like the accumulation of resources into the early adopters. So people who are into crypto even the last 10 years or even now are going to be better off than the people who aren't. And is that fair? That's a thought experiment, probably not. Something to think about. You know, is privacy as a base layer something that we really want? Do we want everybody to be able to transact privately? Is that kind of fundamentally against what the blockchain is about? Having said that, as a citizen, I don't want to have all of my transactions broadcast on a public ledger, because we know that the people who are doing this potentially Orwellian surveillance currently are the same people who will crack down should it be something they don't appreciate. So, you know, in an ideal world, there would be no privacy because there would be no punishments for people doing good things, right? But good things is subjective to the people who do the punishing, and thus we need the privacy, because I could do something that I think is really good for society and for the future of humanity, but I guarantee there's a few people in power who would disagree with those things and track me down through these methods. So I think what we're doing is a big thought experiment. I know people who still stand by, if you're not doing anything wrong, what have you got to hide? Which is just the biggest psyop ever. But, you know, it is all a thought experiment right now. So I totally understand what you're saying.
So you mentioned sort of the black pill perspective, and, you know, talking about like the hierarchies, and is there this conversation to be had about, you know, of all the people that got in earlier, are they just going to be sort of the rich elites at the top, and is it going to perpetuate the same system? But as you said, right, we're in a big thought experiment, and the wonderful thing about the space, as I said earlier, is there are all these novel voting mechanisms. So while, yes, money does kind of, you know, rise to the top, you could also be said that in this space there are many ways, and there are people working on this now to combat those kinds of deficiencies in the system. So while someone might have a lot of money and be able to move things in a certain way, there are also voting mechanisms being developed that actually weight differently. You know, the votes are weighted, so it's not just about, oh, I have this much power because I have this much resources. We can create these novel mechanisms that filter down more to, you know, as Jelani was saying, like there are different communities and people are in different, you know, different socioeconomic backgrounds, in different geographies and things. We can actually factor those people in, you know, and we can create these mechanisms where we say, well, actually, you know, person X, Y, and Z is from this geography, and they just don't have the access to the same resources as we do. So we kind of weight their vote a little differently. You know, and that's just one example of something you could do. Just to circle back to the privacy thing, I had a question from a friend that he thought was important, so I wanted to ask you this. So what special considerations for privacy and confidentiality of the subjects, either in experiments or the authors themselves of studies and things? What kind of considerations need to be made or are being made when these studies become decentralized? Is that something you guys have thought about?
Yeah, I mean, I wanna ask Jelani his thoughts on all of that, but I just want to say the technical side of it, right? I'm not gonna quote Solidity here, but basically you can offer people multiple different ways to interact through DeSci for, in particular, funding research, as an example, right? You want to fund research. Okay, I have lots of money and I want to go and fund something I care about. My daughter has a rare disease and I want to fund research in that. I'm going to put some money up and I want someone to come and fund someone come take that money and do some research. Now, that person needs to have good credentials, otherwise I don't want to give them my money, right? They need to have verified identity from being at a certain university or trained in a certain way. Do I need to know that person's identity? Well, most people would say yes, I'd like to know that person's identity because it's important for the research and I'm giving them money to do so. Now, what if that wasn't about your daughter's rare disease, but that was about, I don't know, something to do with something that Big Pharma is pushing and you're anti that, right? So you go and research the antithesis of what Big Pharma is currently pushing. Now, again, you want the person you're giving money to have good credentials, but are they going to want to reveal their identity? You probably not, right? Because it's a dangerous thing to do. So how do I then interact with that person anonymously, but while still having confidence? There are ways. ZK proofs is something that DeSci is going to use incredibly well. But aside from that, it kind of all boils down to the individual need and the confidence required for that individual need in this particular situation in DeSci, in my opinion, because some people won't need that extra level of verification. Some people will, and some people won't be able to give it, and some people will. So that's just kind of like the optionality there. But in terms of like how important it is for science, I think Jelani's far better suited to answer that.
Yeah. So this is where DeSci comes right against real world regulation. So in the real scientific biomedical space, there are regulatory bodies and regulatory constitutions that have to be followed in terms of making sure that patients and individuals have their privacy and their data is private. So you can't track back where this data comes from to the individual person. And so DeSci space as a whole is cognizant of it because many of the builders who are in this space are actual scientists of various disciplines of various forms, and we have been trained and almost drilled into that you have to have these considerations. So HIPAA and GDPR are two of the main bodies, constitutional regulations that make it that enforce this notion that things have to remain private. And so one of the key ways that this is being done is that actual data, so the data itself is not necessarily being uploaded on the blockchain. Let's say, for example, you yourself you have a medical history. Everybody has a medical history. Well, if you want to participate in a DeSci and centralized clinical trial, well, your medical data does not need to be put onto the blockchain for all to see, right? The commit of your medical data is not that's not what's going to happen, right? So you'll have hashes that relate back to that data without actually de-identifying that data. And so most of the frameworks, Weave Chain is one, IPFS use these frameworks to kind of bring this together. So there's still paramount prioritization of privacy as it comes to medical data and scientific data. But what it does is it allows for ease of access for people to get the information without identifying the person. Now, with that being said, there are other instances where that is not the case, right? So, for example, there are a lot of entities that have popped up that are doing things like 23andMe and Ancestry, where you can get your genetics sequenced and then find out a whole bunch of stuff about yourself, your phylogenetics, your ancestry, your predisposition to certain medical conditions. And those, by virtue, are extremely public. But as Josh mentioned, oftentimes what happens in these scenarios, so Genomes DAO is a good example of this. Genomes DAO and CryptGen are two entities that do this in a Web3 infrastructure. But the ownership of that data remains solely within the hands of the recipient, of the person who donated it, right? So as Josh said, if a third party genetic testing or a third-party pharmaceutical industry wants access to your genetics, they have to come to you and you have to bequeath unto them that information or access to that genetic code. So on one end, there is, if it's not down to the individual, then it's not committed to the blockchain and remains private. On the other end, if it can be brought down to the individual, well, you have to give the consent to that. So again, just to circle back, prioritization of privacy of medical information is paramount, at least so far as I have seen in the DeSci space. So that's been very good.
Yeah, that's
And
one.
it speaks to, I just want to bring out one thing. So it speaks to the fact that, DeFi and DeSci are going to intermingle with each other, but DeSci is going to have to deal with two regulatory entities or two regulatory spaces. There's going to be the financial space, so the three-letter financial entities, but there's also going to be the scientific and privacy, so the FDAs, the WHOs, all these entities that regulate the governing medical bodies. We're actually going to have to deal with two regulatory bodies, and so that's something that to keep in mind. And the HIPAA and the GDPR considerations are there, but I think there's a lot more conversations that need to be had in terms of what else we have to deal with in this space. I don't think we quite understand it fully yet.
Yeah, I would agree. And I think one of the things you mentioned, ZK proofs. One of the things I'm really interested in right now, and I think is, kind of just coming out of the space. At least there have been conversations about this for a long while, but at the moment it seems that projects are really kind of pushing for this, and that is decentralized identity. And just to link it back to what we were talking about before with DAOs and them being sort of a meritocracy. I really like the idea of scientific credentials being attached to a decentralized ID. I think that's really cool, and how that'll interact with DAOs and how that'll enable people to collaborate with new sort of trust mechanisms, or they're, as we call it, trustless. So I think that's one really interesting space. I'm looking forward to see what goes on there with decentralized ID, and then how that interacts with the traditional sort of professional world. And I also think one of the things you mentioned, privacy, and there are a lot of other things regarding regulation that we'll have to deal with. This was something that I can't remember, one of you guys mentioned Balaji before, and he brought up the idea on the Lex Fridman podcast of, I'm not sure if it was his idea, but at least he brought this to light. At least my understanding of it is some kind of IoT, Internet of Things, lab equipment. Some kind of idea where, for example, like the temperature of the room would automatically be recorded, or each device, each bit of equipment. Exactly, all the metadata, so the serial number of each device, and then, theoretically you could link that back along the, the production chain, and, that came from XYZ factory in China, and then the resources or the metals that maybe this machine was made from, you can source that back, and so you can get really granular when it comes to all of the external things that affect experiments and things. And I think that's a really interesting space to kind of think about. Do you guys have any opinions on that? The kind of Internet of Things lab equipment idea?
Yeah, so that's far coming, because what you're going to need is you're going to need blockchain integrated machinery hardware for that to really happen. But that is something definitely I see coming down the line. I think the most impactful point from that is to the replication crisis. So for listeners who don't know, science, though it informs how we operate in civilization down to the most granular things that we do, most science has been shown to be non-replicable. So that means, as an example, if someone publishes a paper, it's very hard for people to take that same paper, redo the experiment, and come to the same conclusion. This is the replication crisis. Now, part of that is, again, active malfeasance, and some of that is just lack of granular information about what is going on. So, for example, if you're in a location and there's a machine and an earthquake goes off, and that throws off the metrics of the machine, now all the data is going to be skewed, right? There is a lot of environmental impact of all forms that will skew experiments and cause variabilities. This whole Internet of Things is a way to kind of smooth out that trend so that we can go all the way back and make sure that on that day we can determine the humidity level and all these kind of things that might have played into regulating or changing the results of that experiment. So having that Internet of Things, the point that I think Balaji was bringing up, or part of the point that he was bringing up, is that blockchain and the Web3 infrastructure will hopefully allow us to address these things and deal with, or at least have a better tool set to deal with this replication crisis.
Yeah, I kind of want to, again, I don't want to be too much of a contrarian, but I want to take a slightly different point of view. So in this particular example, Jelani, as a scientist, comes across the replication crisis as a huge problem in his field, and in science in general, it is a massive problem. It's publicized as such, so even for us that aren't scientists, it is a big problem for us too. And what we consume in pharmaceuticals and all kinds of anything that gets put through the research is a problem with us. This is now a problem for us too, right? The Internet of Things, though, by definition, will be omnipresent everywhere, right? This concept of tracking all types of data will be omnipresent everywhere. So it will be in places where people who aren't affected by these things will have it. And this is just kind of like so when it comes to blockchain is immutable, right? Which is a fantastic thing for many reasons. And we on the pro crypto side are saying, well, look, we can hold our leaders to account. We can hold our financial institutions to account because we can see what they're doing and we can hold them to account. And that's great and it's true. But there is two sides to every coin, the yin and the yang. And that means that everything that we do on the blockchain is immutable. And anything that we do can be held to account. And that's the same for the Internet of Things. Whilst the Internet of Things collects all kinds of data, which helps many specific issues uniquely, right? The way that the Internet of Things will help the replication crisis is unique to that method. There's no other thing that will do it such, unless you get everybody to record it at the same time every day, but which just won't happen. So it provides a unique set of benefits, but it also provides a unique set of challenges, just like blockchain does, in the sense that you're collecting data that maybe people don't want to be collected. You're making assumptions on data, which we do all the time right now. And I think that as a concept is a huge problem. You make assumptions based on data, based on statistics, and then you put policies in place to combat those assumptions, right? And that is incredibly anti-human. The more tech that we introduce into every aspect of our lives, the less human we become. And for some, that is actually a benefit because humans are fallible and weak and stupid and whatnot, which I am not a believer into that point of view. So the Internet of Things, whilst it's going to solve many critical issues and it's going to do it in a fantastic way, we really must be cognizant in this space about the unique challenges that it's going to bring, such as massive, global, continuous surveillance, and what will be done with that information once it's gathered, what policies will be made, what opinions, most people don't make policies, most people follow policies. So there's a very small subsection of people that will see this data, make policies, and the rest of us will just live in that world. And we need to just be very careful what data we're gathering, how, and how much of it. Data is attractive for lots of people. They like to just sift through the data and find patterns, and we need to just be very careful about what's done once those patterns have been found.
So I don't want to harp on this point too much, right? But I want to make one statement. So to be counter-contrarian to Josh, and I want to stipulate this with DAOs. So I think it's Eugene Leventhal or somebody made a commentary that the best organization, this speaks directly to DAOs. So the best organization is one that is made up of people who don't like each other, but have a common goal. Now, Josh and I very much like each other, but we do have slightly different views, right? But we very much share a common goal. And so to his point of, some people, not everybody's going to make the policies and we're going to have this Orwellian network state of Big Brother always looking at us. That's very true. Now, the silver lining under that is that all of that is going to be transparent, or most of that is going to be transparent. So different from how it is today, the people who are making the policies and people who are looking at the statistics, it's not everybody. Not everybody has instant access to that, or even just fragmented access to that. What the blockchain allows is that you can go in and see and look for yourself. So if you don't believe, if you don't ascribe to the policy and the foundation, the logic that is being given to you as to why it's foundational, you don't have to believe that. You can go do your own research, right? So do your own research is a meme catchphrase in the Web3 space. But as it relates to DeSci, more than the other Web3 spaces, is you can actually go do that. All of this becomes public. You can go look at the data. You can go assess the metadata around it. And so that gives you kind of a better opportunity to see and to argue against and to debate. They can't obfuscate it from you. They can, but it makes it a little bit harder. So you can have open access to it and debate it. So, whereas there is going to be it does have its pros and cons. It is going to be a Pandora's box to an extent. I think that the open nature of it and the ability, the accessibility, which goes back to the narrative that we hope to push in DeSci, is it's accessible. You can go and look at it yourself. You don't have to believe it becomes trusted. You don't have to believe the chief medical government officer. You don't need to believe everybody. You can just look for it yourself. And that's very different from how it works today.
Yeah, well, what did he say? Don't trust, verify.
Exactly.
Yeah, well, this leads me into I think this will be the last topic, and then we'll wind down. You mentioned the replicability crisis, and you also talked about accessibility and data. During my research, I heard this term mentioned in regards to DeSci, and that is the dark data storage problem. Would you guys mind talking about accessibility in the context of this dark data storage problem? What is the dark data storage problem, and how does DeSci attempt to solve for this?
In the current iteration of the infrastructure, this is another aspect of DeSci. So when you publish a paper, right, traditionally you have to write these down as papers. Nowadays we use PDFs. It's the main unit of knowledge that is used. Those are very archaic and limited to what you can actually put into that. So you can't put metadata into a PDF. It just doesn't work. I can't put a code. I can't put the timestamp. I can't put all these extra data. So the dark data storage is almost built into the traditional system because we didn't have the tech that allowed us to present all the data in one concentrated unit of knowledge. Okay, so what what is happening in a different branch of DeSci is the development of these novel Web3 based primitives. One perfect example of this is DeSci node, and I highly suggest everybody to go look into what a DeSci node is. And this is a product that is being developed by DeSci Labs. And so what this is looking to be, or what they're trying to do, is they're trying to create a new unit of knowledge that is going to basically the next step of PDFs, where you can put all this data into one entity. So if let's say I publish a paper and I have code that I use to generate figures and graphs and analyze the data, all of that can be put into that paper. It is going to be committed to IPFS. It's going to be bound on, and the hash will be bound onto the blockchain. So it'll be immutable and everybody will have access to that. And so it's a bit complicated to do without visuals, but there's beautiful demos on their YouTube channel that everybody can go and check out. What that allows for is for all this dark data, this unseen data, to be put into the blockchain. Or sorry, put into the published articles that are either going to go into journals or the new institutions that we're going to develop in DeSci that are going to replace or at least complement journals to make them more equitable. And so, yeah, part of it, and I think this speaks a lot to, there's a scientific infrastructure that's been around for about 100 years, and some of it makes it such that it seems like malfeasance or malintention is there, but it's the limitation of the infrastructure. And what DeSci is trying to do is not necessarily replace that infrastructure, but build an alternative infrastructure that can be utilized. And what that'll allow, and we talk about this a lot internally and within leaders, is what it allows for you to do is to resolve those individuals who are just bound and trapped within this archaic system and want to be able to provide this open access to individuals but just can't. And those who are actively malfeasant or maliciously doing this to obfuscate things, right? It gives this opt-in, opt-out option, and it gives this resolution. So that's one of the things, and I'm glad that you brought that up. That's one of the things that the DeSci space is trying to do, build this alternative structure. And there's a slew of tools that are being built there, and these are very innovative and beautiful and very fun tools. And as a scientist, I'm looking forward to working with them, and I show them to all our people. all the scientists that I know in my network. As we wrap up, one of the things that I want to highlight is that different from DeFi, and though DeFi has its use cases, DeSci is impact driven. It's utility driven. It's a lot less speculation. So you're going to have less of the degen-ness. You're going to have less of like the rowdy rah 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 because there's actually use case. Everything is bound from the utility. Whereas in DeFi, sometimes what you'll have is people come up with an idea, they launch a token, they launch all this infrastructure, but there's nowhere to use it. And then they scramble at the end to try to figure out, okay, where are we actually going to plug this in so it becomes sustainable? DeSci is built kind of like how the blockchain is built with certain parameters that make it such. DeSci is built with certain parameters that make it such that it's utility driven and will address a lot of these problems.
Okay, that's a great explanation. So we're coming to the end of the hour now, so I'm just going to wrap up. Is there anything you guys would like to speak on just before we finish, or you think you guys got everything out that you needed to get out?
I'll do a little shout out for the space and for our project.
Yeah, obviously, absolutely. Tell everyone where they can find you. Tell everyone, the links for DeSci World. We'll put all the descriptions in, below. The links in the description below. Sorry. So yeah, go ahead.
Cool. Yeah. So just want to say thank you for having us on. It's really a real pleasure. I hope that everybody enjoyed what we're talking about, and if anyone wants to engage with us or the project, please come to our Twitter or our Discord at DeSci World. Go to our website, decentralized.world. And generally, if you want to go to decentralized.world, go to our dashboard, which is an information aggregator, look through the multitude of projects that are up there. You might find some ones that we've spoken about here. You might find some other ones that interest you. We are here to connect you guys to the right people, to get you involved and interested in this space. So go to decentralized.world, have a look around. If you think something's interesting, we can connect you. We can help you find something that you might not know exists. And that's generally what we're here to do. So it's a real pleasure to be able to come here and actually talk about DeSci so that we can sort of shield the space that I know Jelani and I are very, very excited about for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I'd like to reiterate that. Thank you very much for bringing us on. There's so much to talk about DeSci. It's hard to condense it into 1 hour. So I'm very happy to come back and talk more about this. But like Joshua said, if you're interested, if anybody's interested in learning more about DeSci as a space, kind of a top level overview, please do come to DeSci World. We have a lot of information. Feel free to reach out to myself. My Twitter handle is JelaniC3. I'm also on LinkedIn. You can reach out. I'm always keen to talk about that. And to people who are interested in building projects, if you have an idea, this is the beauty of Web3. If you have an idea and you need a community or you're trying to build something, come to DeSci World. We'll help you connect with individuals who are like-minded and may want to help you build your project. And to all the projects that are building out there, those who we haven't had a chance to learn about and get to, come to DeSci World and list your project. It'll open it up to the DeSci space and allow other people to learn about you, and that'll help your community grow exponentially. Because that's something we didn't talk about for the DAOs, right? DAOs are community driven. The more people you have, the more successful you'll be. And so take that opportunity, and we're community facing, both for the individual and for the team builders. So that's what we're here for, and we're glad to be here. And we're super excited about it.
That's great, yeah, and I love to hear that, because it's something that really stands out in the whole DeFi and crypto space, is that everyone always wants you to join the community. Everyone's so welcoming, and I love that about this space. So yeah,
I just want to touch on that quickly. In the DeFi space, people want you to join their community because it's good for the project in terms of it's good for adoption and generally prices. I'm not saying I work in DeFi full time, so I'm very pro DeFi. Generally in DeFi, when people want you to grow their community, it's because it's good for the price of the project or the token or whatever. DeSci, when people want you to join their community, it is much more because like you can actually contribute to the utility function that Jelani mentioned of that project, of the whole space. Like science needs people, finance needs money, right?
And I think a beautiful example of that is if you go to many of the projects in the DeSci space, and there are, almost hundreds of them at this point. Most do not have tokens. And those who do have tokens, it's solely for governance. So the incentive, the perspective, the priority is it's to raise funds to help it, but it's not speculation on the token price. So it's a completely different ethos. It will use DeFi as a supporting structure, but it's not the same kind of thing. And I understand, DeSci is a new space and people kind of have this, oh, it's DeFi, and all the people have been burnt by DeFi, and the FTX and all this kind of thing going on. It scares people off, but believe me, and you don't have to believe me. You can check it for yourself. You can do your own research, verifiable. DeSci is utility driven to help the scientific community, and again, that's not just biomedical. That's computational AI, philosophy, physics, psychology. I even had a theology conversation with somebody who's interested in studying a DAO in Bible studies. If it's scientific and if it applies to scientific method, there's a space, there's a home for you in DeSci. So come home, join the tribe, because we are very much a tribe, and let's build together. Let's make science a better place for everybody. Let's make the world a better place for all.
That was beautiful. And yeah, I absolutely love that message. Thank you very much for coming, guys. I would love to have you back again sometime in the future. Maybe
Anytime.
delve a little, deeper into the specifics of things like IP NFTs, or maybe like you just mentioned AI. That's a really interesting space as well. But yeah, thanks again for coming, guys. Thanks everyone for watching. This is Fiat Lux. You know what to do. Comment, like, and subscribe. And we'll see you guys in the next episode. Peace.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye, everybody.